The first thing Marge Whitfield noticed about her new neighbor wasn't the pristine landscaping with a modest two-story colonial that blended seamlessly into Willowbrook Estates' carefully curated aesthetic. It was the mailbox, where every other residence in their upscale subdivision boasted regulation black or hunter green postal receptacles, approved models from the HOA's meticulously crafted architectural guidelines. This one dared to be different. Hand-carved from what appeared to be reclaimed driftwood, it featured intricate nature scenes with tiny birds perched on flowering vines. Worse yet, native wildflowers had been planted around its base, creating a small meadow that spilled rebelliously onto the pristine sidewalk. Marge's perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her morning coffee mug as she peered through her kitchen blinds at the offensive display. After 8 years as president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, she had transformed this neighborhood from a collection of houses into a showcase of suburban perfection. Property values had increased by 30% under her iron-fisted leadership. Every blade of grass knew its place, every fence post stood at regulation height, and every resident understood that conformity wasn't just expected, it was mandatory. "Not on my watch," she muttered, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had sent cease and desist letters to residents for infractions as minor as leaving Christmas lights up past January 2nd. At 53, Marge had perfected the art of neighborhood intimidation. Her silver hair was always styled in a razor-sharp bob that seemed to cut through any argument, and her wardrobe consisted entirely of blazers and slacks that screamed, "I demand to speak to your manager." She had earned her reputation through years of relentless enforcement, turning HOA board meetings into courtroom dramas where she served as judge, jury, and executioner of community standards. The new neighbor had moved in 3 weeks ago with minimal fanfare, no moving truck parade, no housewarming party, just a quiet transition that had somehow escaped Marge's usual surveillance network. She prided herself on knowing everything about everyone in Willowbrook Estates, from Mrs. Henderson's secret cigarette habit to the Johnsons' mounting credit card debt. But this newcomer had remained frustratingly mysterious. What she did know was limited. Single occupant, worked from home, kept odd hours, and apparently had zero respect for community standards. The mailbox was just the beginning. Marge had observed other concerning details through her high-powered binoculars. Bird feeders attracting undesirable wildlife, rain barrels that violated the association's water collection policies, and what appeared to be composting bins tucked discreetly behind native shrubs. But the mailbox was the declaration of war. That afternoon, Marge donned her official HOA president blazer and marched across the street with a clipboard and her most intimidating scowl. She had rehearsed this confrontation 100 times, each variation designed to establish dominance while maintaining plausible civility. The front door was answered by a tall, lean figure in her mid-40s with sun-weathered skin and calm brown eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. "I'm Margaret Whitfield, HOA president," she announced, thrusting a violation notice forward. "Your mailbox is in direct violation of Section 4.27 of our community guidelines. You have 7 days to replace it with an approved model or face daily fines of $50. The neighbor accepted the notice with surprising grace, scanning it briefly before looking back at Marge with an expression that was neither confrontational nor submissive, just quietly observant. "I see," they said simply. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention." Marge had expected resistance, arguments, or at least questions about the arbitrary nature of mailbox regulations. This calm acceptance felt wrong, like a boxer preparing for a fight only to have their opponent offer to shake hands. "Good," she said, thrown off balance. "I trust this matter will be resolved promptly." "I'll certainly consider all my options," came the measured response. Walking back across the street, Marge felt an unfamiliar sensation: uncertainty. In 8 years of HOA presidency, no resident had ever responded to her demands with such unsettling composure. Most people either cowered immediately or blustered with impotent rage before ultimately complying. This neighbor's reaction suggested something else entirely: someone who wasn't intimidated by her authority. That night, as Marge lay in bed planning her next moves, she made a crucial miscalculation. She assumed her new neighbor was just another suburban resident who would eventually buckle under pressure. She had no idea that across the street lived someone whose day job involved taking on corporations, municipalities, and federal agencies, someone for whom neighborhood bullies were merely a minor inconvenience. The war for Willowbrook Estates was about to begin, and Marge Whitfield had just chosen the wrong enemy. Marge stood at her window each morning, watching for signs of compliance that never came. The hand-carved wooden post continued to mock her authority. Its cheerful bird carvings seemed to chirp defiance with each sunrise. The wildflower garden had actually grown more vibrant, as if thriving on her disapproval. On day 8, she issued the first $50 fine. On day 9, another. By day 12, she had accumulated $600 in violations that remained unpaid and unacknowledged. Her neighbor continued their quiet routine, early morning walks, occasional visitors who drove nondescript government sedans, and evenings spent on the back porch with what appeared to be case files and a laptop. "If you want to play hardball," Marge muttered over her morning coffee, "then we'll play hardball." The first prank was almost elegant in its simplicity. At 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, Marge crept across the street with a gallon of fish emulsion fertilizer, the kind that smelled like rotting seafood mixed with barnyard waste. She doused the offending mailbox thoroughly, coating every carved detail with the putrid liquid. By morning, the stench would be unbearable, and surely this would motivate her stubborn neighbor to comply. She watched from her kitchen window as the neighbor emerged for their morning walk, pausing briefly at the mailbox. Instead of the expected outrage or disgust, they simply retrieved their mail, examined the vandalized post with the same calm observation they had shown during their first encounter, and continued their routine. No angry pounding on Marge's door. No heated phone calls to the police. Nothing. The lack of reaction was infuriating. 3 days later, Marge escalated. Armed with a bucket of used cat litter borrowed from various neighbors' garbage cans, she made another midnight excursion. This time, she packed the mixture into the mailbox opening and smeared it across the wooden surface. The ammonia stench combined with her previous fish emulsion created an olfactory assault that could be detected from 3 houses away. Again, her neighbor's response was maddeningly measured. They cleaned the mailbox with garden hose and biodegradable soap, documented the damage with photographs, and went about their day as if nothing had happened. By the 4th incident, involving a creative mixture of rotten eggs, sour milk, and decomposing vegetation, Marge had attracted attention from other residents. Mrs. Henderson from 2 doors down knocked on her door with complaints about the smell. The Martinez family across the cul-de-sac mentioned the unusual odors during their evening walks. Even her closest ally on the HOA board, Janet Kowalski, suggested that perhaps Marge was taking the mailbox issue too seriously. "It's not about the mailbox anymore," Marge explained to Janet over lunch at the country club. "It's about respect for community standards. If I let this slide, where does it end? Purple houses? Garden gnomes? Food trucks parked in driveways?" Janet looked uncomfortable. "But Marge, some of the neighbors are starting to ask questions about the smell. And frankly, destroying someone's property isn't exactly setting a good example for community leadership." Marge waved dismissively. "I'm not destroying anything. I'm motivating compliance through creative enforcement." What Marge didn't realize was that her creative enforcement was being meticulously documented. Each incident was photographed from multiple angles, with timestamps and detailed notes about methods and materials used. Her neighbor had installed a sophisticated security system that captured not just video evidence, but also audio recordings of Marge's late-night muttering as she planned each attack. The 5th prank crossed a line that Marge didn't even recognize existed. Using roadkill she had collected from various suburban streets, including a particularly decomposed raccoon, she created what she considered her masterpiece of disgusting deterrence. The biological matter was distributed around the mailbox base, with special attention paid to crevices where the smell would linger longest. This time, however, her neighbor's response was different. Instead of the usual calm cleanup, they made a phone call that lasted several hours. Official-looking documents were retrieved from filing cabinets. Photographs were uploaded to secure servers. And for the first time since the conflict began, Marge noticed her neighbor watching her house with the same intensity she had been watching theirs. That evening, as Marge stood at her kitchen window admiring her handiwork, she felt a strange sensation. For just a moment, she wondered if she had underestimated her opponent. The thought was quickly dismissed. After all, what could one resident possibly do against the combined authority of the HOA and 8 years of neighborhood dominance? Across the street, her neighbor was making another phone call, this one to a federal office in Washington, D.C. The conversation involved case numbers, evidence protocols, and jurisdiction questions that would have made Marge's blood run cold if she had been able to hear them. The war was about to shift into a phase that Marge Whitfield could never have imagined, and she had just provided all the ammunition her enemy would need. Dr. Cameron Torres had dealt with far worse than suburban bullies during their 15-year career as a senior enforcement agent with the Environmental Protection Agency. Corporate executives who dumped toxic waste into rivers, municipal officials who covered up water contamination, and industrial giants who poisoned entire communities. These were the adversaries that filled Cameron's professional life. A petty HOA president with boundary issues barely registered as a nuisance. But professional habits die hard, and Cameron approached every problem with a methodical precision that had made them one of the EPA's most successful investigators. The mailbox vandalism was being documented not out of fear or anger, but because systematic evidence collection was second nature. What had started as routine defensive measures was beginning to reveal something far more interesting than simple harassment. While photographing the latest biological assault on their mailbox, Cameron noticed something that made them pause. The decomposing raccoon Marge had used wasn't just roadkill, it showed signs of chemical exposure. The fur had an unusual discoloration, and the tissue decomposition patterns suggested the animal had died from something other than vehicular impact. As an environmental scientist with a specialty in toxicology, Cameron recognized the symptoms of pesticide poisoning. That observation led to a more thorough examination of Willowbrook Estates itself. Using publicly available databases and professional contacts, Cameron began assembling a profile of their new neighborhood that went far beyond HOA violation notices. Property records revealed interesting patterns. Building permits showed several unexplained structures on Marge's property that didn't match the approved architectural plans. Chemical delivery logs from local suppliers painted a picture of unusually heavy pesticide and herbicide purchases by the HOA maintenance company, purchases that exceeded what would be normal for standard landscaping. Most concerning were the water quality reports Cameron requested from the county health department. Willowbrook Estates sat atop a watershed that fed into 3 local streams, and recent testing showed elevated levels of several banned agricultural chemicals. The contamination pattern suggested a point source within the subdivision itself. Cameron's investigation methodology was invisible to casual observation. During their regular evening walks, they collected soil samples from common areas, photographed drainage systems, and used handheld testing equipment disguised as fitness trackers. Their morning jogs took them past every storm drain and retention pond in the development. What looked like casual socializing with dog-walking neighbors was actually systematic interviews about unusual smells, dead wildlife, and changes in local vegetation. The picture that emerged was disturbing. Willowbrook Estates' pristine appearance was maintained through illegal applications of restricted pesticides, unauthorized disposal of chemical waste, and systematic violations of environmental protection laws. Marge's obsession with aesthetic perfection had created an ecological disaster zone that was slowly poisoning the local water supply. 3 weeks into the investigation, Cameron discovered the smoking gun. While documenting another of Marge's mailbox attacks, their infrared camera detected heat signatures indicating buried material in Marge's backyard. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed the presence of multiple metal containers buried beneath her prize-winning rose garden. Soil samples from the perimeter showed contamination levels that would trigger immediate federal intervention. The buried containers were almost certainly filled with concentrated pesticide waste, a felony violation of federal environmental law that carried potential prison sentences of up to 15 years. But Cameron's investigation had revealed something even more valuable than evidence of illegal dumping. Through careful analysis of HOA board meeting minutes, financial records, and vendor contracts, a pattern of systemic corruption emerged. Marge had been skimming money from the association's maintenance budget while simultaneously cutting costs by disposing of chemical waste illegally. She had turned her entire neighborhood into an environmental crime scene while enriching herself in the process. The irony wasn't lost on Cameron. While Marge focused her harassment campaign on a supposedly non-compliant mailbox, she was sitting on enough environmental violations to trigger a multi-agency federal investigation that would make national news. As Cameron compiled their evidence into a comprehensive case file, they couldn't help but appreciate the cosmic justice of the situation. Marge's desperate attempts to establish dominance through increasingly disgusting pranks had actually provided perfect documentation of her own criminal behavior. Every midnight vandalism session had been recorded by federal-grade surveillance equipment. Every threat and violation notice had been preserved as evidence of a systematic harassment campaign. Every conversation with neighbors had revealed additional details about the subdivision's environmental problems. The case file that Cameron transmitted to EPA headquarters that Friday afternoon contained enough evidence to support charges ranging from illegal waste disposal and water contamination to mail tampering and criminal harassment. Federal prosecutors would have their choice of jurisdiction and charges, but Cameron decided to give Marge one final opportunity to demonstrate the character that had made her such an effective neighborhood tyrant. A registered letter was sent to the HOA president requesting a meeting to discuss mutual concerns about community environmental standards. The response would determine whether Marge faced her comeuppance through quiet administrative proceedings or very public federal criminal charges. Across the street, Marge was planning her most elaborate prank yet, completely unaware that her target had just finished building a case that would destroy everything she had spent 8 years creating. The perfect suburban kingdom she had built through intimidation and illegal shortcuts was about to crumble, and she had provided every tool necessary for its demolition. Marge's response to Cameron's registered letter was everything the EPA agent had expected and more. Instead of a phone call or email requesting a private meeting, Marge arrived at Cameron's front door at 7 a.m. sharp, flanked by 2 HOA board members and wielding a thick folder of what she clearly considered overwhelming documentation. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing," Marge announced, not waiting for an invitation inside, "but your little intimidation tactics won't work on me. I've been running this neighborhood since before you knew it existed, and I have every violation you've committed documented right here." Cameron stepped aside to let the delegation enter, noting how Marge's companions, Janet Kowalski and Robert Chen, looked increasingly uncomfortable as the president launched into her rehearsed tirade. This was clearly not the approach they had recommended. Unapproved mailbox, unauthorized landscaping, violation of architectural guidelines, failure to pay assessed fines totaling now over $2,000. Marge continued, spreading papers across Cameron's coffee table like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "You seem to think that ignoring our community standards makes you some kind of rebel, but I have news for you, Mrs. Whitfield." Cameron interrupted gently. "Before we discuss community standards, perhaps you'd like to know who you've been harassing for the past month." The question caught Marge off guard, but only briefly. "I don't care if you're the mayor's cousin or some kind of lawyer. Rules are rules, and—" Cameron walked to their home office and returned with a leather credential case, placing it open on the table next to Marge's violation notices. The gold federal badge gleamed next to an official identification card that read, "Dr. Cameron Torres, Senior Enforcement Agent, Environmental Protection Agency, Criminal Investigation Division." The silence that followed was deafening. Janet's face went pale. Robert actually stepped backward, but Marge, true to form, doubled down. "So what?" she said, though her voice had lost some of its commanding tone. "Federal employee or not, you still have to follow neighborhood rules. Your job doesn't make you special." Cameron nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right. My job doesn't make me special, but it does mean I'm trained to recognize certain patterns, like unusually high concentrations of banned pesticides in local water supplies, or the specific soil contamination signatures that indicate illegal chemical disposal." Marge's confident expression began to crack. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do." Cameron retrieved a tablet and began displaying photographs. "These are images of the buried containers in your backyard, Mrs. Whitfield. Ground-penetrating radar confirms at least 12 separate burial sites beneath your landscaping. Soil samples show contamination levels that exceed federal safety standards by a factor of 20. The photos were damning. Heat signatures clearly showed the buried waste, and the soil analysis results were displayed in stark scientific detail. But it was the next series of images that made Janet Kowalski gasp audibly. "These are the financial records from your HOA maintenance contracts," Cameron continued. "Over the past 3 years, you've been billing the association for proper hazardous waste disposal while actually burying concentrated pesticide waste on your own property. The cost savings were substantial, nearly $40,000 that you diverted to a personal account." Robert Chen was already backing toward the door. "Marge, you told us this was about mailbox compliance. You never said anything about—" "Shut up, Robert," Marge snapped, but her authority was evaporating with each revelation. "This is entrapment. You moved here specifically to spy on me." Cameron's laugh was genuinely amused. "Mrs. Whitfield, I moved here because the house was in my price range and had good schools nearby for my partner's kids. Your environmental crimes were a surprise discovery, though I have to say your harassment campaign made the investigation much easier than usual." The tablet display shifted to surveillance footage of Marge's midnight mailbox attacks. Each incident was timestamped and recorded in high definition, showing her face clearly as she spread various biological materials around Cameron's property. "Mail tampering is a federal offense," Cameron explained conversationally. "But more importantly, your choice of vandalism materials provided excellent evidence of the local contamination. That raccoon you used last week, it died from organophosphate poisoning, specifically from chemicals that were banned for residential use in 1995. The only way it could have ingested those compounds was from groundwater contamination originating from your property." Marge was no longer standing. She had sunk into Cameron's armchair, her face cycling through expressions of rage, panic, and dawning comprehension. "The beautiful irony," Cameron continued, "is that your mailbox obsession documented every aspect of your own criminal behavior. 8 months of harassment, all captured on federal surveillance equipment. Financial fraud spanning 3 years, all traced through HOA records you helpfully organized. Environmental contamination affecting 17 neighboring properties, all connected to waste buried in your prize-winning garden." Janet found her voice first. "Marge, please tell me this isn't true. Please tell me you haven't been poisoning our neighborhood while we trusted you to keep us safe." But Marge's response revealed the character that had made her such an effective tyrant. Even faced with overwhelming evidence and certain prosecution, she couldn't accept that her authority had limits. "You people are all against me," she screamed, jumping to her feet. "I built this neighborhood. I made your property values what they are. And this is how you repay me? By believing some federal bureaucrat over your own HOA president?" Cameron closed the tablet with a soft click. "Mrs. Whitfield, you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, The Miranda rights that followed marked the end of Margaret Whitfield's reign over Willowbrook Estates. But as Cameron would discover, Marge's downfall was just the beginning of a much larger story about what happens when suburban tyranny finally meets its match. 6 months later, the Willowbrook Estates that Margaret Whitfield had ruled with an iron fist was unrecognizable. Where once stood her perfectly manicured kingdom of conformity, federal environmental cleanup crews worked around the clock to remediate 3 decades of contamination. The EPA's investigation had expanded far beyond Marge's backyard burial sites to encompass the entire subdivision's environmental infrastructure. The criminal case against Margaret Whitfield became a textbook example of how small corruptions can spiral into major federal crimes. Her plea hearing drew reporters from 3 states, all eager to cover the story of the HOA president who poisoned her own neighbors while harassing an EPA agent over mailbox regulations. The judge's comments during sentencing became legendary in environmental law circles. Mrs. Whitfield, Judge Patricia Ramirez had said, "You stand convicted of 17 federal felonies including illegal disposal of hazardous waste, mail tampering, fraud, and criminal conspiracy. But perhaps most damning is the evidence that you continued your crimes even while being investigated by a federal agent whose credentials you refused to acknowledge. Your arrogance is matched only by your reckless disregard for the safety of families who trusted you with their community's welfare." The sentence was severe but proportionate. 12 years in federal prison, full restitution for environmental cleanup costs exceeding $2.3 million, and lifetime prohibition from serving in any homeowner association leadership role. Her house, built on a foundation of buried toxins, was condemned and demolished as part of the remediation effort. But Marge's personal downfall was only the beginning of Willowbrook Estates' transformation. The HOA board, horrified by the scope of their former president's crimes, voted unanimously to dissolve the existing architectural guidelines and start fresh with community input. Janet Kowalski, elected as interim president, made the neighborhood's first official act a formal apology to Dr. Cameron Torres and a request for their expertise in creating genuinely sustainable community standards. "We spent 8 years following rules that we thought made us superior to other neighborhoods," Janet addressed the packed community center meeting. "Instead, we were unknowingly participating in systematic environmental destruction, while our elected leader committed felonies in our name. We owe Dr. Torres not just an apology, but our gratitude for exposing crimes that could have killed our children." The mailbox that had started the entire conflict became a symbol of the neighborhood's rebirth. Instead of demanding its removal, the new HOA board commissioned local artists to create a matching series of hand-carved wooden mailboxes celebrating native wildlife and sustainable landscaping. Cameron's original design became the template for a community art project that attracted visitors from across the region. More importantly, the federal investigation had revealed the extent of environmental damage throughout the subdivision. Groundwater contamination affected 17 properties. Soil remediation was required for 32 homes. The retention pond that Marge had maintained for aesthetic purposes was actually a toxic waste lagoon that had been slowly poisoning local wildlife for over a decade. The cleanup effort became a model for federal environmental enforcement. Cameron, promoted to regional enforcement director partly due to the Whitfield case's success, worked with the community to implement cutting-edge remediation techniques. Solar-powered water treatment systems replaced contaminated wells. Native plant restoration projects transformed chemical-dependent lawns into thriving ecosystems. Rain gardens and permeable surfaces addressed drainage problems that had masked contamination for years. The financial impact on surviving residents was substantial, but federal victim compensation funds and successful civil suits against the companies that had supplied illegal chemicals provided significant relief. Property values, initially devastated by the environmental scandal, recovered within 3 years as Willowbrook Estates became nationally recognized as a model sustainable community. Marge's former allies faced their own reckonings. Robert Chen resigned from the board and moved to another state, unable to face neighbors whose trust he had enabled Marge to violate. Several other HOA board members faced civil lawsuits from residents who had suffered health impacts from the contamination. The management company that had facilitated Marge's illegal waste disposal practices was fined into bankruptcy, and several executives faced criminal charges. But perhaps the most satisfying justice came from unexpected quarters. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly neighbor who had initially supported Marge's authoritarian approach, became one of the most vocal advocates for environmental restoration. Her grandson, diagnosed with childhood asthma that doctors linked to local air quality issues, became the poster child for a class action lawsuit that ultimately recovered millions in damages for affected families. 3 years after her imprisonment, Marge Whitfield's appeals had been exhausted and her requests for early release consistently denied. Prison interviews revealed a woman still convinced that her only crime was caring too much about community standards. She showed no remorse for the environmental damage, continued to blame federal overreach for her prosecution, and maintained that her neighbors have been ungrateful for her years of dedicated service. Meanwhile, Dr. Cameron Torres had settled permanently into their role as both neighborhood resident and environmental advocate. Their house, once the target of harassment, became an informal education center where visiting researchers studied successful community-based environmental remediation. The hand-carved mailbox still stood at the end of their driveway, now surrounded by a thriving native garden that served as a living laboratory for sustainable landscaping techniques. On quiet evenings, Cameron would walk through the transformed neighborhood and reflect on how one person's obsession with control had ultimately freed an entire community from decades of hidden toxicity. Marge Whitfield had intended to make Willowbrook Estates a showcase of suburban perfection through intimidation and shortcuts. Instead, her downfall had created something genuinely valuable: a neighborhood where environmental health, community cooperation, and authentic sustainability replaced the hollow facade of forced conformity. The mailbox that had started it all remained a daily reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance can expose the largest crimes, and that justice, while occasionally delayed, has a way of finding even the most well-hidden corruption. In trying to destroy what she couldn't control, Margaret Whitfield had inadvertently saved her own neighborhood from the slow poison of her leadership, and ensured that her name would be remembered not as a community builder, but as a cautionary tale about the true cost of unchecked suburban tyranny.